No, it's fine, it's only been 8 months since I covered Injustice 1. I swear it wasn't supposed to go like this. I planned to save MKX for Mortal May, but I got sick and Mortal May didn't really happen this year. Then I forgot all about this until now. Rules were laid out in previous episodes. Some fights here are interrupted with no real results, such as Johnny's fight with the two ninjas getting interrupted by Kenshi, or Raiden ambushing Sindel before she can beat Fujin, so those won't count. I struggled with the bit where Quan Chi knocks Raiden down and then gets taken out by Fujin. Does that count as a win, even though Raiden gets back up a few seconds later? I think no. If they're rendered unconscious or go down and don't get up until after the next scene or gameplay, in an actual fight and not a sucker punch, they are bested. Also, this game has a lot of cutscene fights against unnamed NPCs. These tend to end very quickly, and I think it just complicates things to include them, so it's named characters only. Let's get on with it. The game opens with Johnny Cage's chapter. He defeats Scorpion, defeats Sub-Zero, defeats Smoke in a cutscene, defeats Jax, defeats Shinnok, defeats Sub-Zero in a cutscene, defeats Jax in a cutscene, and loses to Scorpion. That's 7-1. Sonya Blade loses to Jax in a cutscene, loses to Shinnok in a cutscene, defeats Quan Chi in a cutscene, defeats Scorpion, defeats Sub-Zero in a cutscene, defeats Quan Chi in a cutscene, defeats Jax, defeats Quan Chi, kicks the shit out of Quan Chi, which doesn't count but is very funny, defeats Kano, and loses to Scorpion. That's 7-3. Just under half of them are Quan Chi, so he's already on the shortlist for biggest loser. Cassie Cage loses to Sub-Zero, loses to Ferritor in a QTE, loses to Tanya in a cutscene, loses to Ermac in a cutscene, defeats Sindel, defeats Kitana, defeats Devora, and defeats Shinnok. That's 4-4. Jax defeats Sonya in a cutscene, loses to Johnny in a cutscene, loses to Sonya, defeats Kung Lao, defeats Sindel, defeats Kitana, defeats Liu Kang, and punches out Quan Chi, which doesn't count but is very funny. That's 5-3. Jackie Briggs defeats Sub-Zero, loses to Ferritor in a QTE, loses to Ermac in a cutscene, defeats Reptile, defeats Ermac, defeats Ferritor, defeats Kotal, and loses to Kitana in a cutscene. That's 5-3. Kenshi defeats Nightwolf off-screen, loses to Takeda, defeats Cabal off-screen, and loses to Scorpion. That's 2-2. Takeda loses to Sub-Zero, loses to Ferritor in a QTE, defeats Scorpion in a cutscene, defeats Kenshi, defeats Reptile, defeats Eren Black, defeats Ermac, loses to Ferritor off-screen, and loses to Kitana in a cutscene. That's 5-4. Kung Jin loses to Sub-Zero, defeats Eren Black, defeats Ferritor, defeats Raiden, defeats Kotal, loses to Eren Black in a cutscene, loses to Ermac in a cutscene, and loses to Kitana in a cutscene. That's 4-4. Raiden defeats Cabal in a cutscene, loses to Kung Jin, defeats Baraka, defeats Devora, defeats Kung Lao, and defeats Liu Kang. That's 5-1. Scorpion loses to Johnny Cage, loses to Sonya, loses to Takeda in a cutscene, defeats Sonya, defeats Kenshi, defeats Johnny, defeats Sub-Zero, and defeats Quan Chi. That's 5-3. Sub-Zero loses to Johnny Cage, defeats Cassie, defeats Takeda, loses to Jackie, defeats Kung Jin, loses to Johnny in a cutscene, loses to Sonya in a cutscene, and loses to Scorpion. That's 3-5. Shinnok defeats Sonya in a cutscene, loses to Johnny, and loses to Cassie. That's 1-2. Quan Chi loses to Sonya in a cutscene, loses to Sonya in a cutscene, loses to Sonya in gameplay, and loses to Scorpion. That's 0-4. Liu Kang loses to Jax, and loses to Raiden. That's 0-2. Kung Lao also loses to Jax, and loses to Raiden. That's also 0-2. Kitana defeats Serena, loses to Jax, defeats Kung Jin in a cutscene, defeats Takeda and Jackie in a cutscene, and loses to Cassie. That's 4-2. Melina loses to Kotal in a cutscene, loses to Kotal in gameplay, loses to Ermac off-screen, and loses to Devora. That's 0-4. Kano loses to Kotal Khan, and loses to Sonya as per usual. That's 0-2. Kotal Khan defeats Kano, defeats Tanya, defeats Melina in a cutscene, defeats Rain, defeats Melina, loses to Kung Jin, and loses to Jackie. That's 5-2. Devora defeats Baraka, defeats Rain, defeats Tanya, defeats Melina, loses to Raiden, and loses to Cassie. That's 4-2. Reptile loses to Takeda, and loses to Jackie. That's 0-2. Ermac defeats Melina off-screen, defeats Kung Jin in a cutscene, defeats Jackie in a cutscene, defeats Cassie in a cutscene, loses to Takeda, and loses to Jackie. That's 4-2. Eren Black loses to Kung Jin, defeats Kung Jin, and loses to Takeda. That's 1-2. Ferritor defeats Jackie in a QTE, defeats Takeda in a QTE, defeats Cassie in a QTE, loses to Kung Jin, loses to Jackie, and defeats Takeda off screen. That's 4-2, and it's all Kombat kids for some reason. And now for the NPCs. Baraka loses to Devora and loses to Raiden. That's 0-2. Rain loses to Kotal Khan and loses to Devora. That's 0-2. But his dropkick on Kotal is very funny. Sindel loses to Jax and loses to Cassie. That's 0-2. Tanya loses to Kotal, defeats Cassie in a cutscene, and loses to Devora. That's 1-2. Bo' Rai Cho is defeated off screen by Shinnok and 5 Revenants. I think it's fair if we void this because we know nothing except that it's a curb stomp. Frost goes down too fast for it to count. Fujin defeats Striker. That's 1-0. Cabal loses to Raiden in a cutscene and loses to Kenshi off screen. That's 0-2. Li Mei has no fights period. Nightwolf loses to Kenshi off screen. That's 0-1. Serena loses to Katana. That's 0-1. Smoke loses to Johnny Cage. That's 0-1. Striker loses to Fujin. That's 0-1. Now comes the part where we look over the data to reach some fun conclusions. I won't count the NPCs here because them having lower numbers is just natural. It really wouldn't be fair. The fighter with the most fights is Sonya Blade with 10. The fighters with the least fights are Kano, Kung Lao, Liu Kang, and Reptile with 2 each. The most overdone matchup is Sonya vs Quan Chi with 3, in one scene. The fighters with the most wins are Johnny and Sonya with 7 apiece. The fighters with the least wins are Kano, Kung Lao, Liu Kang, Melina, Quan Chi, and Reptile with 0. The fighters with the most losses are Cassie, Quan Chi, and Melina with 4 each. The fighters with the least losses are Johnny Cage and Raiden with 1 each. The strongest ratio is Johnny with 7-1. The most balanced ratios are Kenshi with 2-2 and Cassie and Kung Jin with 4-4. The weakest ratio is Quan Chi at 0-4. This time, since we're sticking with an existing continuity for once, I'll be adding some new awards based on that. The biggest glow up is Johnny Cage, who had an even spread across his 8 fights in MK9 and this time won all but 1 of the same number of fights. Additionally, his victories last time were against 3 jobbers and Sonya. This time there are some serious A-listers going down to him. It's fitting that he wins this award in this game. The biggest downgrade is Liu Kang, going from 8-1 all the way down to 0-2. Absolutely pathetic by comparison. So our final conclusion is that Johnny Cage is the winner of Mortal Kombat X, having the strongest ratio, the biggest glow up, tying for most wins, and tying for least losses at only 1. The biggest loser is undoubtedly Quan Chi, who ties for most losses, loses thrice in one scene, has 0 wins, has the weakest ratio, and a stagnant matchup list with 3 out of 4 being against Sonya. And while it's not counted in the statistics, he is rendered unconscious the most out of all the characters, with it happening several times outside of actual fights, in addition to the fights. Check the pinned comment for corrections. Next time we return to the DCU for Injustice 2, which will present a new challenge for this series. Therefore, I have a question for you guys. How should I tally the duo chapters in the next 2 games? Should each potential victory count as a win, as half a win, or should I display the range of possible wins? I'm not going to comment on how long this will take lest I jinx it again. I'm sure some of you will still be alive by the next one though. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? For the rest of the year, you get 1 day early access to new videos for just $1 a month. Today's recommended video is Mortal Kombat X is better than MK1 by Steel!